Hey guys, Fiore here, and we're going to talk about Edmund Burke today. And this is part of my series where we look at key texts from the 18th century, or the Enlightenment, if you will, and we read them really closely, almost line by line, trying to squeeze out the meaning, the context, and ideas for further thinking, and maybe linking ideas together and looking at also where the history of ideas, springs from. So, so this is Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke is mostly known today when you ever hear the name Edmund Burke. He's mostly known as the writer of a very key political tract that was rejecting the idea of revolution, and in particular the French Revolution. And so he's kind of like a provocateur for many of the revolutionaries, radicals, progressives of the late 18th century. So that would be people around the time of 1780, 1790, but mostly after 1790. And he wrote, and the name of the text is called The Reflections on the Revolution in France, and he's a defender of the status quo in France. So the monarchy as a political system, the aristocracy, as part of the social and political system, and in the case of England, the state church. In other words, of course, there's no separation of church and state at this time. That was what one of the principles of the American Revolution was. Ironically, he was for the American Revolution for other reasons, which we'll go into another time, but he was against the French Revolution. So 1776 was okay, 1789 was not. And some of the more famous reactions were by Thomas Paine, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Man in response to Edmund Burke, and of course the amazing and inimitable Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the first major response called The Vindication of the Rights of Men. And so I have a painting here by Fragonard, an 18th century French painter, of a woman reading in honor of the many women scholars, intellectuals, saloniers, historians, artists of the 18th century. And that happens to be my field, the study of Mary Wollstonecraft's work and other women of the 18th century. But for today, we're going to take a look at an early work by Burke. And in the early work of Burke, he's not yet in the Parliament, and later on when he writes his pro-conservatism argument, he's going to be in the Parliament here. He's a younger guy, and he's writing something called The Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And this work is not so well known. It's not in a lot of anthologies, but it actually was very, very influential in the world of art and even in the world of psychology. And the idea is, I'll ask a question to you guys. So first of all, is there a way to categorize and study the human reactions to things that impress them? Say in nature, you see a beautiful flower and you have an impression of that. Or you see an ocean, and you have another impression of that. And normally we would call both beautiful, I guess, right? Maybe with the ocean, you might have a word like spectacular, or a more powerful word. And for flower, you might say moving, touching, or pretty, But Edmund Burke says that actually, in fact, we can talk about how people react to impressive objects or sights, and we can actually make a science out of that, or let's say a philosophy out of that. Same thing with art. Can we categorize and discuss the types of reactions people have to different types of art, different forms of art, whether it be a tragedy, a Greek tragedy with incredible violence, a revenge plot like a Hollywood movie like The Equalizer with Denzel Washington, very extreme revenge plot, a love story, a poem, things like that. So this is important because for many reasons. First of all, the whole philosophy of aesthetics is something that had kind of fallen away in the thousands of years since the Romans, who were who talked a lot about that. The Greeks especially talked a lot about taste and the sensitivity to art, sensitivity to nature. So it had fallen away, and now it was making a comeback, and it has a lot of applications. Number one, the idea is that we could use psychology to understand emotional reactions to things like art, like nature, and vice versa. We can use our reactions to art and nature to understand our psychology. So in a way, this is an early psychological text. So this is long before there even is a word called, there even is a study called psychology. So in a way, you could look at it as a foundation of psychology. But also, this text had a lot of influence on actual artists. Beethoven. If you listen carefully to Beethoven, you'll see that and if you like that kind of music, you'll see that there, as opposed to Mozart earlier, he says that there is a kind of a awareness of the different types of reactions he wants from the listener. You know, not just kind of to be pleased or entranced, but to be scared or absorbed or darkened, or, you know, and you just see a lot more changes in mood, and that comes from this idea of sublime and beautiful. And maybe the most famous effect was on Mary Shelley, who's the writer of Frankenstein. Again, I go back to Mary Wollstonecraft, the writer that I like to think about, and that's her daughter. And the idea of fantastic scenes and fantastic over-the-top situations, you know, bringing a body back to life and death, right? So, so the whole idea of sublime and beautiful has a lot of applications. There's applications to gender studies, because the categories of sublime and beautiful are gendered. Things which are overwhelming and powerful are sublime, and things which are cute, manageable, small, cute, you know, quaint, pretty are beautiful, right? So again, you can obviously see the obvious gender implications of that. There's a lot of things going on with Burke, and so the text is really rich. And so it begins with really what is a kind of a philosophical move, which is of making distinctions between different mental reactions, right? And that was a very, big topic of discussion in the 18th century. You know, this idea of like, how do we react? Why do we react? What is happening when we don't think rationally? What are alternatives to thinking rationally? So again, a big correction to a very typical popular view of the Enlightenment. You know, it used to be called the age of reason, right? Where rationality and science were going to overtake superstition. And now it appears that that's not really what was happening. There was a discussion about rationality and about the value and place of rationality in all the various functions of human life. So this is just another one of those. You know, so the play of reason, imagination, impulse, passion, you know, and psychological impulses like anger, revenge, right? Fear, right? So this is kind of like the matrix that all of these ideas come out of. It's quite beautiful, this matrix of questions about what is the difference between the rational part of my mind and the irrational part, right? So that's how it starts. And we'll read it bit by bit here. So the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. So there's a lot of mix of words here, but the key here, all its motions are suspended. You can start from there. You got a little core of the sentence. All its motions are suspended. All its motions are suspended. So you have to first get into the word astonishment, which in its root, in its etymology, and I really strongly believe in using etymology as much as you can when trying to understand philosophy and literature. So astonishment comes from a French root, the T-O-N part, just that little T-O-N section means to be struck or bludgeoned, you know, until you're dizzy, right? You're getting hit with a bat, right? And when you're hit with a bat, all the motions of the mind are suspended. He says here soul, and there's special reasons why he uses the word soul, which actually, to tell you the truth, I don't know. But but he means the normal functions of the human mind, right? So I know enough to say that that's what he means by soul. And please comment, you know, if you have corrections or you know stuff that I don't know. I'm totally open So what he means is that when you are struck by something, and see, we use the word struck, right? We use the word struck, the things that are beautiful, the things that are impressive. When you're struck by something, the normal motions of the mind, the normal functions of the mind, thinking, remembering, judging, they're temporarily suspended, right? If you walk in the street like I used to do, just stare at the beautiful stuff and architecture and things, and you hit your head on a parking sign or something, you can't think for a second, right? So this is what it's all about. In what moments is our mind suspended, right? And then we go to the next part, which is with some degree of horror, right? Like we're uncomfortable when our mind is not functioning in all the ways we like it to function. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. So what is a thought or a feeling that completely occupies your whole mind, right? Just fills all the space. So if I have a regular thought, an everyday thought, and I say, okay, tomorrow morning about 8 o'clock, I just check out on my phone here, oh yeah, I got a meeting at 8 o'clock. You can think of other things at the same time. You can multitask, as they say. But if you're super scared of something, really scared, if you're about to fall off a building, or you're on your bike on a trail and you're about to fall, your mind is that's it. It takes up all of your mind. You can't have two thoughts at once. That's what he says, so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason on that object which employs it. You can't be thinking, this mountain is actually 4,365 meters high, and then if I fall at a rate, no, you're not thinking, you're not calculating, you're scared, right? Or at least you're occupied with the thought of danger, right? So hence arises the great power of the sublime, that far from being produced by them, it anticipates our reasonings. So the sublime is not produced by thinking, but we can think about the sublime when the sublime moment is over, right? Right. So that takes care of a lot of objections. Like I can think my way into a state of incredible wonder. No, you can't. Maybe there are some words that can induce you to feel a sublime feeling, but you can't reason your way into sublimity, right? It has to be a feeling, a lot like fear, right? As he's going to say in a second. So, and hurries them along by irresistible force. Astonishment, as I said, is the effect. Let's see what's going on next here. Of the sublime, let me move my face out of the way here. Of the sublime, in its highest degree, the inferior effects are admiration, reverence, and respect. So they love that in the 18th century. You think of a principle, here's the principle of the sublime, something which occupies your mind completely. Okay, we've got that established. And now we think of gradations of that principle. So a less intense feeling is admiration. A less intense feeling of sublime is also reverence, right? So if you're a religious person and you're blown away by the presence of God, right? Like let's say, or you're in love, truly deeply in love, and you're just so overwhelmed with that feeling. But reverence is not quite there. Reverence is more like a kind of an amped up respect, right? So he uses words very carefully. So these are gradations of sublimity, right? And let's go into the etymology for a second of the word sublime, right? Sublime. So L-I-M-N, right? Used in words like limit or liminal, and which means the extreme border of something. Let's say the limit of my capacity to be amazed, right? So sublime, passing beyond the limit, or passing below the limit, right? So that's where the word comes from. So beautiful. Okay, and then he says no, and then he explains that why sublimity is actually not only related to fear, because it's like fear, but you can never have sublimity without some kind of fear, right? So and then think about that. At first it feels a little weird. How could say I'm looking up at the stars, right? And I'm just amazed at how beautiful the stars are. Burke says there's a little fear in there. Let's see why. No passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. For fear being an apprehension of pain or death, it operates in a manner that resembles actual pain. because fear is usually the fear of pain or dying. And so it's as if you had the pain when you have the fear. I'm not sure if I agree with this part actually, but I'm after a different point. Whatever therefore is terrible with regard to sight is sublime too. In other words, terrible, 18th century terrible means full of terror, right? Not terrible like the food is terrible. Is sublime too. So anything that fills you with terror is sublime. Right? Whether this cause of terror be endued with greatness of dimensions or not, for it is impossible to look on anything as trifling or contemptible that may be dangerous. Right? So he says, usually sublime things are big, but something that could kill you that's small also has a feeling of the sublime. So like a guy who wanted to look, a guy, let's say, had tattoos in the old days when people had tattoos when they were in gangs. Now more people have tattoos, but in the old days, most of the people that got tattoos were like in gangs or, sailors or soldiers or things like that. So you're not going to have a tattoo of like, let's say, a plate of really delicious pasta, right? That's not sublime. But you might have a tattoo of a scorpion, right? Because a scorpion can kill you. Or a tattoo of a sword or a knife, right? Small, but dangerous. It could kill you. So these things, he says, it doesn't matter what the dimensions are. A small thing could be sublime too, if it has the power to kill you, right? So you might be thinking, okay, we're mixing up the word sublime here, which in modern English means, if I say, oh, the movie was sublime, or the speech I heard was sublime, or I love this work of art, this music. But that's exactly what he does mean. There are some changes of words and other words are not changing. And in philosophy, the word sublime does mean something that is overwhelming from an artistic point of view or an emotional point of view. And Burke is saying the reason it's overwhelming is because of fear. So I'm kind of repeating, I'm kind of overlapping what I'm saying. So hopefully I'm not becoming too dense here. But okay, so then there are many animals who, though far from being large, are yet capable of raising ideas of the sublime. As I said, the scorpion, right? Because they are considered as objects of terror, as serpents and poisonous animals of almost all kinds, right? Not a full sentence, but okay, we'll forgive Burke for this. I got to go look at the original text and see what that's all about. And to things of great dimensions, if we annex an adventitious idea of terror, they become without comparison greater. So he says, let's look at some big things, right? So the ocean is big and a plain is also big, like say a field of wheat, like an endless field of wheat, right? I'm not going to say desert for a special reason. He says a level plain of a vast extent on land is certainly no mean idea. It's pretty getting towards sublime, right? The prospect of such a plain may be as extensive as the prospect of the ocean, right? So it could be, you can maybe not see the horizon, or the corn goes all the way to the horizon, let's say, like if you guys ever traveled in the United States and you drive through Nebraska, in July before harvest. Oh, it's incredible. Corn and wheat that goes on forever. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But Burke would say it's not. So Nebraska is not sublime. Nebraska would be beautiful. Right? And the reason for this is because the ocean can kill you. The ocean can technically kill you. Very hard to die by getting lost in a field of corn, although corn mazes are pretty scary to me. And we could actually, that's not such a crazy thing to think about or weird, a tangential thing to think about, because we might be imparting certain types of fear onto certain things. And then Burke would say, that's fine, because then for you, that's sublime, because it does add the fear, right? So that's what he's saying. Something is big and it has the factor of fear, even in the back of your mind, it's going to be sublime. When we look at space, space is the most dehumanized place ever, right? We like to fill space with possible aliens. But in fact, it's a pretty unfriendly location for human beings. And one of the reasons it's so beautiful to look into space is because if you end up out there, you can die, right? You can die. And so space, the ocean, nighttime, darkness, which has no end, right? We don't know where a room begins or ends, or a forest begins or ends when we're at nighttime. So these large spaces are, today we just say, wow, that's a beautiful sight from your balcony looking over, the bay. But maybe for Burke, the ocean was even more sublime than it is for us, because people died in greater numbers in the ocean than they did, than they do today. But anyway, that's you get the basic idea, right? So something that's great, large, is striking to you because it is sublime. And now the reading woman here, down here, looking down, let's see if I go, yeah, that's the way to look. Looking down there, these intellectual women of the 18th century were all over this, and they were actually responsible for making a lot of these ideas current, because, as you may know from the history of the 18th century, there was a group of women called the Bluestockings in England. In France, they were called the Salonières. And there were salons and readings and books and periodicals by women who actually brought a lot of these ideas out. So it's not so random to have this woman with us reading, even though she is wearing a very fashionable outfit, the intensity that she's reading with, and the recognition of in the 18th century of women that read, how sublime they were. A lot of philosophers of the 18th century reacted with fear towards women who read, right? So there's a sublimity of a different sort, right? So, so that's what he's talking about here, right? And then towards the end of the paragraph, he says, several languages bear a strong testimony to the affinity of these ideas. So he says you can actually hear it in the words themselves, that languages actually attach fear and beauty, or let's say I won't say by saying beauty, I'm actually breaking up his little binary of sublime and beautiful. But let's say fear and being impressed, right, by something like the ocean. The words actually join those two things together. We use them regularly. So if I say, how was your trip in the sailboat, this morning at dawn, and I would say terrific, right? So it joins this feeling of fear, right? It has the word terror in it. And we understand the word terrific to mean utterly wonderful at the same time. And he has a lot of other words like that. He uses the word astonished, right? And he actually goes to the French étonné, right? I hope I'm pronouncing right. Which means to be struck. Like, it's not fun to be struck. I would not like to be struck with a big, metal pipe, although it has happened to me in my very interesting past. But it's not fun, right? But that's what it's like to be impressed with something to the level of sublimity, to be struck by something, right? To be astonished by something. Even the word amaze, right? Think about amaze, has the word maze in it. It's not fun to be lost in a maze. I talked about the corn maze before. But what about the mythological mazes, right? Of the Minotaur, right? And being lost in a maze, maybe for centuries, right? So to be lost in a maze is not a fun thing. It's a disorienting and scary thing. And yet we say, that's amazing, as if to say that's beautiful or that's beyond beautiful, right? So this is what he goes from the psychological material at the beginning, and he goes to talking about how fear works into great spaces, or even into little animals that can kill you, right? So fear is actually always part of the sublime. And then he goes into the etymology of certain words, and he's going to go into why, and this is going to go beyond just, acute kind of, looking at word roots, which is, fantastic. But he has a special reason why he's going to talk about language. And we'll talk about that in part 2 of this Burke presentation. So just to sum up, let's think together. The sublime is a feeling of impression that you might have in art, in nature, maybe even by a person. And it's overwhelming. It occupies the mind. It freezes all rational thought, at least temporarily. And there's always anything that has that little element in it of possible death for you. That usually is a sublime thing. Okay, that is the idea. I thank you for listening, and we will continue with part 2 of Burke's Sublime and Beautiful.